So speaking of Steve, Stephen Mintz is the one who invited me to speak here 3 or 4 years ago. It's just shortly after Kaufman's Hill came out. And then time went by, and then COVID happened. And then he wanted me to do it on Zoom, and I'm not really a fan of Zoom. I thought Zoom teaching always had a kind of a sadness afterwards, and now we're back to in person. So 3, 4 years went by, and then Janice took over and got back in touch with me and said, what about that reading you never did for Stephen? So we kind of got this back to life in the last couple of months, and I'm going to do kind of a reading and a talk, hoping that's okay. I promise it'll be less than an hour, and there'll be time for question and answers. But I gave the title to it that I guess some of you saw, The Journey Toward Voice, because Stephen wanted me to have it focused on something. So that's where we're going to kind of begin after I thank you all for being here, and I really appreciate it. So there's 2 keys for me that I learned over the years about writing prose, whether it's creative nonfiction, memoir, or fiction. 2 things most important are the sense of the rhythm of language, and everybody thinks that rhythm is in poetry. Prose doesn't have rhythms. Prose has really profound rhythms to it, and the only way to hear your rhythm is to read your writing out loud as you're revising it, and you can hear if the rhythm's there, if it's idiosyncratic, if it's yours. The other thing, I'm not going to talk about rhythm, it's voice. And voice is the elusive, I think we're all after, not just writers, musicians, artists, painters, architects. The sound that's you, the way of the lexicon that's you, the tropes and the language and the beats and the diction, your voice. And we think, well, that's pretty easy to get to. I just figure out who I am. Once I figure out who I am, I hate cliches, but you peel off the onion, there's myself, there's my voice. What I found out is it's not quite like that. And Larry, where are you, my dear friend Larry? He wanted a little philosophy in here tonight. So I'm going to throw a word out that Larry knows, deontological. And deontological means it's all about the process. You don't go across the bridge to get to the other side. You go across the bridge because you go across the bridge, and the process of going across the bridge is what it's all about. And I think that's what it's like trying to find your voice. You just don't look, find it there, I'm finished for the next 50 years, here's my voice in writing. I think it's about, doubts of who you think you are, doubts about the self. I mean, Keats used to talk about in his letter and to his friends the year before he died, negative capability. It's not really quite that, but it's the idea that you have doubts about the person you think you were, which makes you then look inside, and then you see parts of yourself that you didn't recognize before, that were in the dark before, and those other parts of the self comes up. And that's the first part of the journey to finding your voice. The thing that gets in the way is anxiety, anxiety of influence, right? And we all have writers that supercharged us early on, poets, fiction writers, and they inspire us. But at the same time that they inspire us, it's a trap because we sound like them. We can't get them off our back. For me, it was Faulkner. I had Faulkner in high school back in the late 60s. And then I went to college and I started writing like Faulkner. And then I went to graduate school and got my PhD and taught in the 80s at Boston University. And I wrote 2 novels. Actually, the first one had an agent. I went to New York, went pretty well, but I just knew they weren't right because I was writing like Faulkner, really bad Faulkner. And the first they have this problem where Keats and Shelley, the Romantics, because the second generation Romantics had to deal with Wordsworth and Coleridge and the people that came before. And the Romantics are the first to stress uniqueness, creativity, imagination. And once you stress that, that's a burden because you're looking over your shoulder and say, how am I going to write like Kubla Khan? How am I going to write like Wordsworth? So Keats and Shelley knew that anxiety of influence. And that's the second thing you have to do. You have to go into these doubts of the self, but you then have to find a way to get beyond your influences. So I abandoned writing novels. I was teaching at Boston University in the 80s, and I moved into creative nonfiction. And I love the meditative essay and, the freedom that you had, the freedom of the mind. And so I started publishing a lot of meditative essays. And then it came time for me to do more with it. And this book, Paranoid Content, which came out in 2004, it says in the front, a personal essay on Western thought. So it's on intellectual history of the West, from Greeks and the ancient Jews to modern America in 200 pages, but it's in essay form. So it's hopefully reader friendly. And at times It's intellectual at times, it's just personal. And then, of course, I pushed the boundaries with University of Virginia Press, who can be very stodgy. And every chapter I started putting in a passage in italics that was either a fantasy or a fiction. And the reason I did that, because the book is based upon the ancient paranoia concept of the Greeks, which para means beside, noia means mind. So if you're paranoid, you're going beside the mind. And we usually think of it as negative, like quit being paranoid, get normal. But I realized before Plato, the paranoid word was positive. It meant you were going off track in a dangerous, creative, prophetic way. And we've lost that sense. We've lost the sense of going off track because we're going to pursue some dangerous vision. So that's what the book ended up being about. All the people that have been off track in a dangerous, creative way, whether it's Emily Dickinson or Virginia Woolf or Friedrich Nietzsche. And I got to chapter 6, and I wanted to do a little thing in italics. It was either fiction or fantasy. And I remembered a memory I had about this Huck Finn character when I was a boy named Taddy Keegan. And I remember him telling me that he could fly off of Kaufman's Hill. And of course, I said, no, you can't. And he wanted to prove it to me, and he was going to jump off the hill, and I pulled him back. So in this serious book about intellectual history, which made Virginia Press and the Board of Trustees kind of apoplectic, in the middle of talking about serious intellectual thought, I start talking about the petomia of childhood. And petomia, P-E-T-O-M-A-I-A, is the Greek word for life on the wing. Living a life, pursuing what might be false hopes, but you're not sure. And that idea of life on the wing kind of connects to the other word I coined, paranoiac, which is this dangerous, creative journey off track. So in this passage, I'm comparing Taddy Keegan jumping off the hill to life on the wing, to a dangerous, creative journey. And I put it in the book, not thinking much about it at the time. But the petomia of childhood can be perilous, like on Kaufman's Hill one time. Kaufman's Hill, a bluff left standing after half the hill above where we used to live in the woods, was carved away in order to build one of the great new suburban department stores in the twilight year of 1962. Kaufman's Hill is covered with a thick honeysuckle vine called crown bitch. Crown bitch, we used to call it when we stood at the small clearing at the top of the hill just outside a thin patch of woods, and thought about climbing down the steep slanted bluff of matted green, which was filled with millions of spiders thriving in the warm, moist Pittsburgh summer, and beyond at the white concrete monstrosity which was sorrowfully been imposed there by bulldozers that we ladled with doggy shit as soon as the workmen left to go home. Me and Taddy Keegan stealing cigarettes from the dashboards of cars in the Kaufman's Hill parking lot, hiding them in a hollow of an old tree at the top of Kaufman's Hill. Taddy Keegan, whose arrival in the neighborhood saved me from the terrible Brick Street kids who had tortured me since I was 6. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it ends with real prayer is madness and the call of the paranoiac, experienced as petomia. I am flying inside a moment upon an air of uncertain hopes. So, sorry, I'm perspiring up here. Must be all these lights. You notice that was in past tense, right? That's an adult looking back. And when you write memoir, you have a crucial decision to make. Are you going to write as an adult looking back to something that happened in childhood? Or are you going to write in the perspective of the child right then? And I had a writers group. I'm guessing a lot of you have writers groups. Watch out for the tyranny of the writers group. Because they will gang up on you sometimes, and they will say, this is what you should be doing. And there's times where you just have to say no, no, and no. Because after I wrote that passage, Paranoia and Contentment came out, I started getting infatuated with these memories of boyhood. And I said, well, do I have a memory earlier than that? What about back when I was 7? And I had this little memory of these bullies, the Creeleys, and this rat. And I wanted to write it, maybe 6 or 7 pages. And I wanted to write it from the perspective I had then as a 7-year-old. And my writers group said, no, write it as an adult looking back. And their real reason was, if you write as a 7-year-old, then you're stuck with a 7-year-old's vocabulary. And we all want our writing to be beautiful and lyrical. And how do you make it beautiful and lyrical if you're stuck with a 7-year-old's vocabulary? So the great challenge then was how to do that. And against the wishes of my writers group, I wrote this first chapter, and it's called Rat Stick at Twilight. And it's this memory of 7. And when I went on tour, where are you, Janice? Talked about the tour. And I don't know how that happened. The book just took off, went to a second printing. And next thing I know, I was going all over the country, 24 cities, 31 readings for a boyhood memoir about Pittsburgh. I wish I could go back and do it all again because it's all kind of a blur now. But I always got the question when the Q&A came up is, how do you remember all that stuff in 7, 8, and 9? How do you possibly remember it? And I know it's a question of belief, really, but you just have to go back and you have these images and you meditate on the images, and it just begins to unpack itself. Now, I don't know if it's all true. When the book came out, Bancroft made me do a disclaimer, and all these lawyers got involved and had to change all the names for libel. And the disclaimer says, everything in the book is true as far as I remember it, But it doesn't matter because it begins to unfold. And what happens is your subconscious kicks in. I'm a big believer in the subconscious. And the subconscious kind of leads you to where you need to go. You just need to be open to the subconscious. And as I started writing the book, starting at 7 years old, after a while, I got halfway through the book and I realized every chapter had a key scene at twilight. I didn't even know that because the conscious self was putting the book together, but the unconscious self is directing you. And I realized twilight was key to what I was trying to do. This twilight experience, this twilight time in our country between 1961 and 1968, when the book is set. Everybody knows the 50s, everybody knows everything after 68, but that early mid-60s to me was a twilight time. And I wanted to get to the twilight of human experience then, when parents didn't talk to kids and kids went out free and there was no play dates and just be home for lunch and be home for dinner. And if bad shit happened, you didn't tell anybody. If somebody's wife was being beaten, we didn't know. And if somebody was depressed, shut up about it. It was a really paradox between everything being closed off and people being closed off. I never told anything if bad happened to me. Nobody did. But at the same time, it was a time of incredible freeness because you could leave the house at 7 years old, go wherever you want and just be home for dinner. And my daughter, who's now 23, whenever she would have those moments when she didn't have a play date and she was 7 or 8 or 9, she would say, Papa, I had a Kaufman's Hill afternoon, meaning it was free, totally free, a little dangerous, So that's what I wanted to capture. And, I had to stay in the voice of that boy. And the struggle was, of course, to make it lyrical. And so this goes back to my point before about the problem with voice and how we find the voice and being in doubts about who you are and finding parts of yourself that you didn't know were there, that remain unrecognized, that remain dark. So I'm going to read a little bit from the opening chapter of Rat Stick at Twilight, and the narrator here is 7. And again, the choice of that perspective and the problem with language and rhythms. I was down at the creek hitting at just about anything with the Creeleys. We whipped our sticks at leaves and branches and rocks, and even at the soft silver mud along the creek bank. When we got to the sewer tunnel, the Creeleys stopped and balanced themselves on top of some creek rocks. The late afternoon was cloudy and smelled like rain. The air was still except for the cool sewer dampness blowing upon us. The Creeleys stepped onto the slab beneath the tunnel and started slapping their sticks against the metal bars that crossed the top half entrance until Frank Creeley's stick flipped out of his hand and landed on the other side. Go get it, he told his younger brother. We were all afraid of walking inside the tunnel, so Billy didn't move until Frank pushed him into the creek water. I pretended to ignore them by examining the underside of a mossy rock. Billy ducked quickly under the bars and walked into the tunnel, his feet stretched out to the side so he wouldn't have to touch the dark water. A few minutes later, he stepped back out, holding Frank's stick in his hand like a trophy, and jumped across the creek, landing under a tree on the other side. Hey, look at this, Billy yelled. Frank crossed the creek, his left foot and pants getting wet along the way, and I followed along the creek bank until I could see Billy poking his stick at a dead rat about the size of a small football. It was bloated in the middle with dark matted fur and closed eyes. Billy jammed his stick at its stomach harder and harder until I couldn't look anymore. It's dead, he finally said. What should we do with it? Whenever the Creelys found anything, they always thought they had to do something with it. Pick it up, Frank said, his voice sounding serious, but Billy didn't move. The air began to smell heavier, and I wished it would rain, so we'd all have an excuse to go home. Come on, we'll use our sticks, Frank Creeley said. I was worried because I knew the Creelys. They might try and fling the rat at me or knock me down and drop it on my face. We could take up to the field, I said, and bury it. Who wants to bury some smelly old rat, Billy Creeley said. You're supposed to bury a dead animal when you find it, I said. For some reason, Frank said, okay, and they followed me up the creek bank, carrying the rat carefully, so its dark body jammed between their sticks. Go on and dig a hole then, Frank commanded. So I ran ahead up to Kaufman's field and chose a flat spot next to one of the right rocks of the Kaufman's people had placed there where our woods used to be, and began scraping at the grass with the bottom of my stick. It was hard to break through the soil, though, and I was afraid the Creelys would get bored before I got anywhere, so I scraped faster, occasionally glancing back to watch them trying to balance the rat in the air. Whenever the rat fell, Frank yelled at Billy and hit him with his stick, and Billy screamed because he didn't want the stick that had touched the rat touching him. And they continued like this, jamming their sticks harder into the rat each time until I thought they might stab it all the way through. Eventually, they had held it steady in the air and paraded around in circles, and I heard them whispering. I turned just in time to see their arms swing toward my face and Billy screaming, like Tarzan does. For a moment, the rat hung by its guts at the end of their sticks before soaring over my head and landing with one dead bounce on the rock behind me. The Creelys seemed to lose interest then and lay down on the brown grass, some of the green rat guts still hooked onto the ends of their sticks. This is just temporary boredom, I thought. Eventually, they'll start up again with rat stick torture. And Frank is always the worst because he's older and can make us do whatever he wants. Mother thinks there's something wrong with him, and that's why he doesn't have any friends his own age. My hole was deep, but not wide enough, so I kept grinding my stick, feeling the blisters coming on as I knelt down until late afternoon light with everything seemed to be slowing down. Maybe that's why I didn't hear Georgie Porgy arrive from the direction of Kaufman's Hill. What are you guys doing? He asked. Nothing, Frank Creeley said, without lifting his head. We're waiting for him to finish digging, Billy said, sitting up on one arm. Why? Georgie Porgy asked. Because we're going to try and bury a rat, that's why, Frank said, his voice impatient, his eyes still closed, as if he couldn't wait for Georgie Porgy to go away. Where's the rat? He asked. Over there, Frank mumbled, lifting his arm to point, as if he was making a great effort. Georgie Porgy, who was Frank's age and always dressed in adult clothes ever since his father died, stepped onto the rock and holding his blue tie against a bright yellow shirt, examined the rat like a doctor, examining an accident victim. He even touched the rat with his fingers, turning it over. I know just the thing to do, he said, but you'll have to wait until I run back to my house. We're still burying it, Frank said. Yeah, when the hole's finished, the rat's going in. Without lifting his head, Frank squinted his eyes at Georgie Porgy, who glided back across Kaufman's field, moving pretty well for a fat kid. He didn't seem to shift his legs as he pulled his way up to the crown vetch on Kaufman's Hill. At the top, his yellow shirt flicked for a moment in the light of the graying pink sunset and then disappeared into the woods. I continued to work on my hole, hoping the Creelys wouldn't see I was nearly finished. As long as they hear me digging, I thought, they will keep pretending they are napping. While Georgie Porgy glides along the path through the woods and then runs to the backyards, his fine clothes flapping in the breeze, and on up Nakoma Street, where his old brick house on Standish, where his yellow shirt finally disappears behind a screen door. You have to get the book to see what happens. So, the other point I want to make about memoir is you have to kind of deconstruct the past. It's not about this thing happened to me. You know, I had a terrible experience. My brother died of cancer, or I grew up blind in one eye, or I went to this terrible place, or this wonderful thing happened. It's not just telling a story of what happened to you. You know, when I was on the tour, there was a couple of places, a bookstore in New York City, and then Charlottesville, Virginia, where they had other memoirists reading. And I always wondered why, when the Q&A came, I got all the questions. And I realized, because my book really wasn't about me, I wanted to project that world of the early mid-60s. The other memoirs were stories about things that happened to them, and they just told the story. And I guess if you experienced cancer, the guy who wrote a book about his brother in cancer, that was interesting, or the woman who was blind. But what I realized more and more is you take the past and you have to kind of disintegrate it, and you have to trust yourself to do that. And then you rebuild it in a new unity of being. And I think, maybe I do that sometimes, maybe I don't, but I think really good memoir, really good, and I don't really actually call it memoir, Bancroft Press did. I call it autobiographical fiction. So you're taking the past and you're writing it in the shape of fiction, almost in the shape of a novel. And you're not just retelling, but you're putting it together and creating a new order and unity of being. So I'm going to read a little bit from the chapter that ended up being one everybody wanted to talk about the most. It's called The Rivers, and it's about Patty Keegan again. But before I do that, I want to confess something to you, just so you know if you decide to go down this path of memoir or autobiography, because you don't get to do it without losing something, without giving something up. If you tell me a story, Tom, about something that happened to you, or a dream you had, or a heart transplant, I don't know, and I decide to write a poem or a story about it, and then it comes out and you say, hey, that was my life, that was my dream, that was my story. Well, writers don't care. Writers will use anything. They'll sell out their friends, their wives, their girlfriends. That's good shit. I'm going to use it. And you think when you write autobiography that you get away with it because you're just using your life. And the confession I have to tell you is you don't. Anytime you use something from your past, tell a story. Think of getting together at Thanksgiving or with family, and you tell that story again, tell that story again. That's a great story. And every time you tell it, you embellish a little bit. And every time you tell it, the story is really good. But you look back to the past, what the story was based on, and there's nothing there. All that you have now is the story. So, that was most poignant to me in the second chapter, where I have this account of seeing JFK go by. It's October of 1961, and he's going from West Virginia to Pittsburgh. And he's, back then there was no superhighways. You had to go in 4-lane roads with stoplights. And I knew he was coming, and I went to the intersection. I wanted to see the parade with JFK and Jackie coming by. And, Bancroft Press, they made me research the whole thing. Is it true? And of course, everything I remember was true miraculously. He went by that road that time of day, and he was an hour late because the clocks had gone back that day. And JFK, I guess, didn't set his clock. So I got there early and waited, and he came by, and I wrote the scene in chapter 2, and it's one of the scenes I'm most proud of, really, because you're trying to write something that's intangible, that's ineffable. And I wrote the scene, and everybody talks about it, and I thought, okay, that's cool. And as I think back now, I have no memory of that moment. All I have is what I wrote in the chapter. So my point is that you do give something up, okay? Your living self sells a chunk of who you are to your writer self, and your writer self says, thank you, I'll take that. And you think you're going to get away with it, but you don't, because the living self has given that up to the writer self, and so it's gone forever. But it becomes your story, it becomes your poem, it becomes your fiction. And what are you going to do? How are you going to disintegrate it into pieces and rebuild, a new unity of being? So I'm going to read a little bit of this chapter, if that's okay. The Rivers. And then I have one more thing I want to read. A little background. So if you haven't been to Pittsburgh, there's a Monongahela, there's the Allegheny River, and they meet to make the Ohio. And you always think of Pittsburgh as this dungy place, but when you come through the South Hills, through the tunnel, and you see the city in this triangle, it's really quite shocking. I think the only thing that competes with it is New York City and maybe San Francisco in terms of just pure beauty of the whole setup of the city. So you need to have a sense of the triangle, the Monongahela, the Allegheny, becoming the Ohio. Have a sense of the steep roads. They were all brick streets. This crazy family, I changed their name. name is Keenan. But he becomes Keegan in the book, Patty Keegan. It was really Pat Keenan. And 9 children, first generation Irish. And the mom used to always say her husband was her 10th child. And I came from a very different family, and I was just in awe of Paddy Keegan, and he really is a Huck Finn figure. And I'm sure things probably didn't end up with him well in the end. But he is the one who freed me from the bullies and took me to a different place. But, you know, Taddy Keegan was Taddy Keegan, and he was going to do anything, even if it meant jumping off the bridge to nowhere. And the bridge to nowhere was a bridge going across the Allegheny River that eventually was finished, and they built Three River Stadium where the Steelers played and won 4 Super Bowls. But back then, you know, in 1967, they built half the bridge and ran out of money. And so for years in Pittsburgh, we had this bridge to nowhere. And the kids from Duquesne and University of Pittsburgh used to get drunk at night and drive their car off the end and see if they could reach the far shore, you know. And it was an embarrassment. My father used to, you know, it's embarrassing. We have a city with a bridge unfinished. So in this scene I'm going to read that I've hopefully disintegrated and created a new unity. Paddy Keegan's decided he's going to jump off the bridge to nowhere. And it's about 160 feet. And his brother has a raft. And it's a random day in October. And the chapter is called The Rivers. I'm just going to read, I'll read most of it. I'm going to skip one scene you don't really get unless you read the rest of the book. But again, my point is voice, okay? And going deeply within, doubts about who you think you are to find that voice that's been covered up. I didn't hear about it till everyone was ready to head downtown. Craig McCann stopped by in a hurry, his body wiggling and his hand jabbing at his thick glasses as he stood on our front steps. He talked sideways at me. You don't want to miss this, he said excitedly. The Keegans are taking their 2-man raft down to the rivers. Taddy says he's going to jump off the bridge to nowhere. Then Craig McCann ran up the street as if he were heading to an emergency and cut through Old Man Hoover's yard and disappeared. A few minutes later, I was cutting through my own backyard. The June day was hot and cloudless, and the white humid sky seemed to press upon me as I made my way to Taddy Keegan's house. His older brother's cab was parked in front, a hack, Paddy Keegan called it, and Taddy and his younger brother Timmy were stuffing a deflated yellow raft and 2 plastic oars into the trunk. Paddy, who was in his 20s and one of the curly-haired Keegans, yelled in a controlled way that Taddy and Timmy seemed used to. Hurry up, you little shits, and remember, I'm just going to drop you off downtown. You have to find your own way home. We can take the trolley, Timmy said defiantly. I have the 35 cents. No one said anything to me, and I wasn't sure if it was because they didn't want me there or because they were too focused on getting down to the rivers. Paddy sat up front, and without even asking, I sat down in the back next to Timmy. A second later, Paddy made the car explode away from the curb so suddenly our heads jerked back. Hey, there's McCann, I said. We could see him running down the cobbled bricks of Nakoma and waving at Paddy to stop, which he did, slamming on the brakes so hard the back tire screeched and slapped up against the curb. Since Paddy didn't own the cab, he didn't seem to care what happened to it. Hurry up, McCann, Paddy yelled through Taddy's open window. McCann climbed nervously into the back seat right on top of Timmy's legs because Timmy wouldn't move over, and they started pushing at each other, and the car took off with the door open and McCann not all the way in. Paddy drove downtown in a way only a cab driver would know, climbing up the steep back streets of Beachview, the car feeling hotter and even hotter with the windows open, bumping across the bricks and trolley tracks that swerved the cab like an amusement park ride. All the while I kept thinking how much easier it would be just take Liberty Avenue straight downtown. How are you going to blow this thing up? Paddy yelled in a bothered voice, because I'm just going to drop you off on the south side. That's it. How about stopping at a gas station? Paddy asked. Surprisingly, Paddy did, at the bottom of Mount Washington. But the blow-up raft didn't fit back inside the trunk. So Paddy said they'd have to hold it on the roof by gripping the edges, which Taddy did from one side and Timmy did from the other. We're not going through the Liberty Tunnel, Paddy said, because it's probably illegal with a raft on the roof. So we'll take the McGardle roadway and go over Mount Washington. I'll drive slow so you guys can hold on. But we only got a little ways up the hill before Timmy's fingers couldn't hold the rubber edge anymore, and the raft flew off the roof and bounced back down the road and into the cars behind us. Paddy pulled over before getting out. He turned around and smacked Timmy's forehead several times with the palm of his hand, calling him a useless idiot. "Oh, the Irish matey," Timmy said, as if he didn't really mind his older brother slapping his face. "Do you have to be so cruel?" "Come on, Paddy," Taddy said. "Quit giving Timmy the business. Let's go get the raft." So the two of them ran behind the car, Timmy continuing to talk fake Irish with his eyes closed as if he was in a trance. After putting the raft back on the roof, Taddy offered to drive so Paddy could try holding on. "You assholes ain't insured to drive my hack," Paddy said, which surprised me because he didn't say anything about us assholes being only 14. So Paddy held the raft with one hand and steered with the other. Taddy held on to the other side, and Timmy kept mumbling Irish as the cab inched its way up Mount Washington and then down the other side, with all of Pittsburgh suddenly coming into view, and the steel mills steaming in the distance, and the cars tooting at us from behind, until he finally stopped next to the old Pittsburgh rail station along the Monongahela River. The station had been closed for years, the glass roof still blackened from World War II, when they painted it that way, my father said, so the German planes wouldn't see it when they came to bomb Pittsburgh. Because Pittsburgh was the industrial capital of the country, my father said. Turned out more tons of steel than any city in the world. McCann and I sat in the concrete wall and stared across the river at the business people at Point Park, enjoying their lunch outside. This is the kind of thing you do, I thought, when you're older and out of school. You sit around on a hot day, watch the river, stare at the city and everything else that exists beyond. "You guys are on your own now," Paddy said, looking back as he got inside his cab. Through the open window, he added, "And be careful, you little shits. Don't get into any trouble." The car spit gravel as it took off, and in that second, I realized Paddy had no idea what his brother Taddy was planning to do. He probably thought Taddy and Timmy were just going to float around in the rivers and enjoy their raft, and McCann and I would just loaf around and watch them. When Taddy and Timmy finally got into the raft, they started arguing about who was in front and who was in back until it seemed they might turn the raft over into the filthy Monongahela, and that would be the end of it. But they quieted, and Taddy let Timmy's end be the front. Paddling together, they headed across the wide brown river toward the point. "What are we going to do now?" McCann asked. "I don't know. We should go to the other side where we can watch them better. But how are we going to get there? Across the Fort Pitt Bridge. But there's no walking allowed on the Fort Pitt Bridge. That's why we have to run real fast," McCann said. So we streaked across the bridge where there isn't even a sidewalk, but only a concrete curb between the cars racing by and the railing, smelling the thick river inside the waves of heat. I never looked up or down, but only at McCann's sneakers flashing back at me in quick rhythm. When we reached the end, we ran toward the Hilton Hotel, then through the pedestrian tunnel underneath the Fort Pitt Monument, finally up the other side onto the lawn at Point Park. Sweating and thirsty, we didn't stop till we reached the edge of the Allegheny River near the bridge to nowhere. Taddy and Timmy were still out in the middle of the water where the three rivers merged together. They didn't seem to be getting anywhere with their paddling. They'd stop for a bit as if they were giving up, then they'd paddle again without making progress. Occasionally, motorboats zoomed by as if they didn't see Taddy and Timmy, but I could see them. After a while, they decided they couldn't make it to the bridge against the current and turned horizontal, rowed to shore, right near where McCann and I were standing. "At least you made it to the Allegheny River," I said, as Taddy climbed out. He didn't look at me or say a word, but just started walking robot-like along the concrete river wall to the bridge to nowhere. Timmy didn't say anything either, which was unusual. I couldn't tell if he was mad at his brother or just mad at the river. He started dragging the raft along the shore in a drudging way, trying to follow close behind Taddy. Eventually, Timmy re-entered the water, floated out toward the middle, where the bridge to nowhere ended in midair. While I was watching him, I lost track of Taddy Keegan. I couldn't spot him anywhere. Maybe he's already climbing the bridge, I thought. And that's when I remembered him talking one time about driving off the end of the bridge to nowhere, just like the crazy college kids did a few years ago, in an old Chrysler station wagon, right through the barriers at full speed, miraculously landing unhurt on the far shore of the Allegheny River. He did it on a dare, Taddy said, and that's how things get done. So Taddy Keegan thought he could do it too, if only someone would let him drive his car. The whole incident upset my father. "It's embarrassing," he said, "for a city with more bridges than any city in the country to have one ending in midair." After the main span was completed, there were problems with property owners on the other side, my father said, which was too bad, because the bridge was supposed to lead to a new football stadium, so the Steelers wouldn't have to play in lousy old pit field anymore. Taddy Keegan had climbed the bridge after all. I could see him moving steady along the upper level of the roadway, but the noontime crowds hadn't noticed him yet. There were so many other things for them to look at. Who was going to see a boy balanced against the handrail with his feet near the green barrels, where they were arranged at the end of the bridge to nowhere. 50 yards below, Timmy floated almost perfectly still in his small yellow raft. I looked for McCann, but he had run up toward the bridge. I decided to stay, though, because Timmy was yelling to his brother. People on the point heard him, his voice taking them right out of their unslanted sunlight. "Brother, brother," Timmy yelled. Don't jump, brother." His words sounded familiar. I had heard them before, and he repeated them. Brother, don't jump. I'm going to jump, Taddy finally yelled back. He was standing on top of the bridge railing, leaning against the last suspension pole, his hair sticking straight up from sweat, his arms raised as if he were signaling triumph. Some of the point people cupped their hands over their eyes to see him better through the noon sunlight. Timmy somehow stood up in the yellow raft and yelled the same thing again, and Taddy yelled back in the same way, and it went on like that for a while until everyone on the point was focused on the two kids and their fake Irish talking that seemed real to some of them. But I knew the difference. I had heard Timmy talk like that at other times in our backyard with my father one time. It was a warm night, and my father was listening to the ball game on his little transistor radio that had its leather case on the garden wall. Through my third floor window, I could hear the hurried baseball announcer's voice, but not his words. And then Timmy Keegan's crazy Irish yelling. I went down to the second floor and then halfway down to the first floor, stopping on the landing. Through the window, I could see Timmy Keegan standing on the flagstones in the lower backyard. Instead of pacing around smoking cigarettes and listening to the game, my father was answering back in the same crazy Irish, like he knew it somehow. I could see them fairly well through the screen, even though it was already dark outside. And it was strange because Timmy never visited my house. Maybe he was just cutting through our yard and ran into my father. The exchange ended quickly when my mother opened the back door and told them to quiet down because they were scaring the neighbors. Timmy ran to the poplar trees in the upper backyard. And my father, "Mother, stop being at me," he said loudly. She jumped up to close the window, even though it was a warm night, because she hated yelling and didn't want the neighbors to hear. And my father headed back into the dining room to pace. In the almost darkness, because no one had put the lamp on yet, and missing the ball game that was still playing on his transistor radio outside, he smoked in circles around the dark mahogany table that had been polished by Lorraine until it shined. So you could see, even in the dim light, my father's image inside the dark wood and then back out of it, circling around, rubbing his fingers nervously against his palms, his slick back hair shiny in the window light, and the gray cigarette smoke raising silvery and circling with a motion all its own in the twilight room before fading into the dark corners. My father's head down the whole time, except when he looked up for a second as he made the turn to pace back the other way, still floating under the bridge. Timmy Keegan yelled again, brother, don't jump!" But Taddy Keegan was already gone, and I was almost too late to see, except for the last dark shape of him against the brightness, his arms still above his head through the downfall sunlight into the Allegheny River that looked black and distant under the noon sky. He stayed underwater for a long time, so long that the people at the point began to believe he wasn't coming up again, and I started counting the seconds to see how long he could last. I thought of yelling out to Timmy, who was peering over the raft into the dark water. He would give the raft a little spin, then look some more, and I wondered why he didn't just jump in and try and save his brother, unless maybe this was part of their act too. I considered swimming out myself into the steel mill polluted water because Taddy had saved me from drowning in the creek. He pulled me by my hair until I was free of the current. So I started running upriver, kicking off my shoes along the way so I was ready to jump in and trying to remember my junior safety lesson so I'd be able to save Taddy Keegan if I found him. And that's when he shot up out of the water without his shirt on, like a white-bodied fish, right next to the raft. And all the people at the point clapped as Taddy Keegan climbed in, as if it were the end of a stage show, and he and Timmy started screaming, brother, and they hugged each other, kissing on both cheeks and hugged again, and the point people clapped again, and I thought, typical Keegan crap. They went on until the point people started losing interest because in their minds, the boys were safe. There was nothing else to worry about. Meanwhile, the boys were floating away on the currents of the Allegheny River, heading toward the Ohio. I had no idea what to do. The sun seemed to get hotter every second, and there weren't any ripples of wind on the river, but the currents were still there, taking Taddy away no matter what. He and Timmy drifting along without using the oars. I watched them as they made a little turn and entered the Ohio River, and then they disappeared behind some buildings. They'll keep drifting west, I thought, until they come to Neville Island. Then they'll get out and try and take a bus home, but they'd have to leave the raft behind because Taddy won't want to, and they'll just keep on drifting, right past Neville Island. I wanted to yell, "Tatty, Tatty," but I didn't know why, and it was too late for that. Most of the business people were heading back to work, and the ones left behind seemed to have already forgotten about the boy who jumped off the bridge to nowhere. I stayed longer sitting on the river wall, trying to fool myself, not worrying about how I was going to get home. Craig McCann had already left for his father's office, but I didn't want to go to my father's office and see him pacing around piles of papers and folders, stopping for a moment to say, "Hi, son," without any surprise. And I couldn't call my mother because she didn't know where I was. So I'd have to take the trolley, even though I'd never done that before on my own, and I only had a quarter. I had found myself walking across Point Park as if I wasn't in charge of my own body, back through the pedestrian tunnel and Hilton Plaza to a trolley stop on Liberty Avenue. 4238 Mount Lebanon Beach View, I remembered that was the streetcar I needed to take, and I kept thinking it was too bad Taddy Keegan wasn't there, because he would find an Irish way to get us on the red trolley car, and we'd look out the window together at all the things that existed beyond. Some sparrows were making a racket underneath the roof of the trolley stop, bothering me so much I looked around for a stone to throw at them, and that's how I found an old nickel on the pavement by the curb. I only need another nickel now, I thought. The birds kept up their noise, floating in and out of their nest up in the rafter, like it was an exciting thing to do. I thought about throwing the nickel at them, but instead walked around with my head down, looking for another nickel. Maybe I should just sneak onto the trolley, I thought, because that's what Taddy Keegan would do. But if I could just find a nickel. I tried using my eyes without dropping my head so no one would know what I was doing, and I kept thinking, the trolley will be here any minute. Maybe the nickel won't matter that much to the conductor man, I thought, and he will let me take the 4238 for just 30 cents, and then I will make it home. How are we doing on time? You guys good for another 10 minutes or so? Okay. Well, when I was doing the readings for that book and on tour, people would say, "Are you going to write another memoir?" And I would say, I don't know. I have to have something else I want to do, another world I want to project. I can't just write because I want to write about more lives, years of my life, or things that happened to me. I need something. And years went by, 2017, 2018. And I knew if I did write a second book, I knew it would open with a line from this Jewish delicatessen that I worked in starting at age 15. It was 1969, Ernie's Restaurant and Delicatessen. And I knew the opening line, but I didn't know the voice. I didn't know the narrative technique. I couldn't write another Kaufman's Hill. You can never do that. And time went by, and it was about 6 or 7 months ago, coming back from the SLO Hotel, getting pizza in the rain. And Amanda may remember this. I said, "You got it. I'm going to use two voices. I'm going to use a third person omniscient narrator who's kind of been hovering around since I finished Soda Lake, which I have here, but I'm not going to read Soda Lake because it's finished, but it doesn't have a publisher yet. And it's bad luck to read from a work you finish and haven't got a publisher yet for it. But it ends with this McQuaid character who's a made-up figure, made up by another made-up figure. And the book ends with McQuaid narrating Soda Lake. And when I was in Ireland, living on Achill Island for a month, trying to write that chapter, I kept thinking, what does McQuaid sound like? What does McQuaid sound like? And then after 3 weeks alone in this house, no Wi-Fi, no nothing, and I'm an extrovert, I heard McQuaid's voice. And I thought, in this new book, Blood and Spirit, I'm going to use McQuaid's voice. He'll be an omniscient narrator, and the other one will be my voice, and it'll go back and forth and back and forth. And that's what I came up with.
You don't need to go back out.
So the last thing I want to read tonight, I'm not being too presumptuous on the time. Is I want to, what's that?
The time's fine.
Time's fine. Is I want to read a little bit of this because it goes back to the whole theme of the evening about voice and finding the voice. And so what you see at the beginning is either me narrating or this third person narrator, and they're very short bits, So I'll give you a couple examples of that. And then I'm going to read one scene. It's just a few pages. And the reason I want to read that scene is it was personally requested because it's a scene it's intense. It's at the Jewish deli and restaurant, and it's about Passover, and it's about the carp and the carving of the fish. And I had these memories of it from age 15 but I wasn't sure. So I went to our local rabbi, who was just wonderful. And he cross-checked all my memories of what it would have been like in that Jewish delicatessen in 1969 with Passover coming. And he asked me, he said, if you ever read in this chapter, you have to read that scene. So I'm going to read that scene for him. But before I do that, I just want to give you a sense of how it works. And maybe it doesn't work, who knows? But waiting to find a way with the voice and the frame. So it opens with that line that was in my mind forever. And it's from age 15, 1969. And it's me, at this Jewish delicatessen for 95 cents an hour. Chapter's called The Pelham, and this is how it opens. Pick a wall, fucking kiddo, any wall, pick a fucking wall, repeated Harry Kelso, manager of Ernie's Restaurant and Delicatessen. His eyes rolled away as he spoke, and his body pedaled backward, duck-footed, in stained black leather shoes, shifting through the gravy trail in the middle of the greased floor as he gestured with his small hands sprouted with thick black hairs toward the tile walls on either side of him, like a man displaying objects for sale that no one wanted to buy. Harry Kelso, the fattest man I had ever seen, always reminding us that we should be grateful for earning 95 cents an hour, and that's why there was no standing around in his kitchen. If there was no pots or dishes to be washed, you picked a wall. And I, feeling oddly relieved that he didn't use my name, I was just fucking kiddo. And then it shifts, this third person narrator. He senses Harry's going down, hopes someone else is there, through the service door so it doesn't fall upon him. Daily, the fat man needs someone to zip his fly. No one wants the job, not even for 95 cents. Still, he always found a kiddo, Sweet Tommy, the busboy with a limp, or Billy Hanna from St. Thomas More with the freakish white-gray hair. They performed the epic zipping, but not Chuck, even though he was the newest kid at Ernie's, because Chuck is the only black kid, so he never gets the ask. After closing, when it's too late for us to take the bus, Chuck likes a ride, and McCann always takes him in his blue Cutlass Supreme. He goes along too because he will go anywhere with McCann, who got him his job at Ernie's at age 15. No one knows if Chuck is his real name, but his time card says Chuck. Where do you live, Chuck? McCann asks. Library, Chuck says, drawing out the first syllable. The streets of Library are potholed and dark, but McCann drives steady, his face illumined orange every time he puffs on his Pall Mall. Where exactly is Library, Chuck? Library, he repeats. McCann points to the windshield with his cigarette hand, speaking his staccato. Before it was Library, it was Loafers Hollow. Did you know that, Chuck? No, man, I live in Library. But where, Chuck? Where do I drop you off? I'll let you know, Chuck says. And he does, at a different house each time. Maybe they are housed the girls he knows. Maybe he doesn't want two white boys to see where he lives. McCann swerves his blue Cutlass toward the curb, but never touches it. McCann knows how to drive. After Chuck gets out, McCann tosses his butt through the open window and wheels the car around with his other hand, power steering. From the blackness near his feet, McCann retrieves an 8-track. This is new, he says. After pausing, he announces, Jethro Tull, as if addressing a room of people. What's it called, he asks. Stand Up. So this is one more section, short, split you back to me. The day Norton got hired in the kitchen, there was an opening at the sandwich board, and McCann made sure I got it. So I was working up front with him. Norton's real name was John Horgan, and when he talked, he sounded just like the man on the Jackie Gleason show that my dad liked to watch. As Norton, John Horgan didn't have to worry about a first or last name. He was just Norton. Norton didn't like working in the kitchen. He wanted promoted too, so he tried to impress Harry by telling him he could cook the corned beef briskets and wash dishes at the same time. But cooking the briskets was the chef's job, Andy Carbonara, an unhappy Italian man who paced around watching over the large silver cauldrons where the corned beef briskets swam in the steaming water. The smell of the brine and fat trapped inside the fluorescent reaches of the rear kitchen. Andy's son, Dave Carbonara, worked in the Papagogo, Ernie's hot dog stand next to the restaurant. The Papagogos sold only Hebrew National all-beef kosher hot dogs. Harry said, "Don't fucking think, kiddo," he said to Norton. "Every time you think, kiddo, you cost me money." And Norton never mentioned cooking the briskets again. After that, Harry used those same words on all the new kiddos, believing that if the fucking kiddos simply worked and didn't think, he would be a successful manager. That didn't stop Norton from talking, though, to anyone passing through the kitchen, because he knew that listening to him would be like walking inside the Jackie Gleason show. And then the last thing I want to read is for the rabbi's request. So, you see this stuff going on, Chuck the black kid in the Jewish restaurant. And, you get into writing about the past, and, another issue comes up is what's politically correct and what's okay. That stuff can drive you crazy after a while. And at a certain point, you can't think about it. You just have to be honest to the truth that you remember. And that's the best we can do with the past. So this may not seem appropriate at times. I don't know. I was asking Amanda about reading it. It's only a few pages. And this was written with myself as narrator, but it's in italics because it's also kind of stream of consciousness. And it's about Passover and the carp and the blood. And it's just a few pages long, and that'll be it. And we'll take some questions if you want. I wasn't prepared for all the blood because no one told me about Passover and the carp. But after Jesus arose on Sunday, April 6th, Passover and the bloody carp began. And who knew the fish could bleed so much when they were mostly made of water? By mid-April, the deli was awash in blood, the counter, the floor, and the forearms of Donati and McCann. 1970 will be no different than other years, McCann said. Jewish customers will line up into the mall to get their freshly filleted carp that they will turn into gefilte fish. In a few days, it will be over. But he and Donati were more like butchers than deli boys for nearly a week, and it was nothing like bread wafers into flesh, with Father Larkin always talking about the miracle of transubstantiation. And I kept thinking how much easier it would be if Ernie would just buy the gefilte fish ready-made. But McCann said, you don't understand the Jews. They have to do it themselves. From my position at the sandwich board, I tried not to witness the slaughter of the innocents, as a Jesuit friend of my father called it. Harry Kelso also watched the spectacle from a distance with sleepy eyes, because even though he was Jewish, he didn't believe in the carp. Some of the customers brought the carp whole, according to Lightning, and then soaked it in the bathtub at home before filleting it themselves, cleaning it before sacrifice, not lambs, but carp, the bloodiest fish that ever lived, according to McCann. And the black kids I saw one time down at the Monongahela River, carving up a fish they had caught. What kind of bloody fish is that? I asked. Carp, they said, the same way Chuck said library. And my father always warning us not to eat anything caught in the Monongahela because the river was too polluted. But the black kids didn't seem to mind. And remembering the story told in my catechism book with the pictures of Moses and the Jews fleeing Egypt, walking in the fine blue robes against an orange desert sky. And that's why I didn't know about the blood and the fish. Not like Jesus, who miraculously multiplied the loaves and the fish that were not carp. With Passover and Easter always in the same month, usually in April, sometimes in March, counted by moons. Rebirth you can count on, Sister Lorraine used to say, beyond any question of faith, decided by the moon. And trying to figure why Jesus had to worry about the moon when he had so many other things to dread. So I was glad I hadn't been promoted to the deli like McCann said I would, because there were too many carp and not enough knives. And I kept trying to look busy at the board, making Reuben sandwiches that hadn't even been ordered. Until Ernie himself on the 6th day of Passover, with the Jews well on their way to the promised land, called upon me without words, just a point of his finger, advancing me from sandwiches into the blood. And Ron Donati handed me a knife shaped like a violin, ordering me to cut the fish in half lengthways, right on the tile counter because there was no room on the bloody deli board. Rip the spine out like a zipper, Donati said, and hand me the fish, with divided eyes and double-mouthed gills. I glanced toward the far end of the sandwich board where Lightning stood smiling with his arms crossed because he was untouchable, while I existed in the space in between, where the carp sometimes slipped from the counter onto the floor, the customers seeing but not caring because it was a long line and they were in a hurry. And Father Larkin explaining on Palm Sunday how Jesus wasn't sacrificed only on Good Friday, but at every Mass, every day, all over the world. The bloodfish smell on me so bad that nothing could dissolve it. So I was ashamed to drive Mary Beth Halen home after dark so she might touch me inside my mother's car in front of her house with the hidden brick porch. So she had to take 2 buses home again until Passover ended. And worried too about my mother smelling the carp in her Catholic car. So I had to be careful until all of the Jews were freed from the Pharaoh, with him already risen and walking around to show off the holes in his hands with no blood and clean. And that's how I became a deli boy. Pure prestige, just like McCann said, and the sacrifice of the innocents left behind. Thank you. Well, I had all these notes. I don't even know if I hit half of what I wanted to talk about, but I think that's enough. And if you guys want to ask questions or kick anything around or use the potty.
Do you have nightmares about the fish?
You know, it's just one of those things again where I had the images and the memory and I just didn't trust it. I thought that can't be. It couldn't have been like that. And I talked to the rabbi, and this absolutely was like that, you know, especially back then. It was a frenzy, right? And of course, the book is called Blood and Spirit. So that's kind of the theme through it, either moments of spirituality or moments of blood. There's a chapter I wrote a long time ago that's going to be in it about me coming back from living in Europe and starting graduate school. And I was driving a bloodmobile in 1977. And the story that's around that. But what's a bloodmobile?
Yes.
I had a bus license, so I was asked to drive it. And I got paid, I don't know, $5 an hour. The bloodmobile would go around to locations, pull over, and people would get into the bloodmobile and give blood.
For money.
For money, yeah. And this really rich lady ran it because she needed a nonprofit to run. And I was this long-haired grad student who drove the stupid thing. But it gets much more involved in that. There's, again, here we go, politically correct. There's a really awkward kind of seduction assault scene in that chapter, which I'm the victim of. But anyway, other questions? Yeah.
Thank you very much. It was great. So I edit memoir, and what you said that was provocative to me was autobiographical fiction. So my question is, as a writer,
Right.
can you embellish for the sake of a good story, or do you have to be
That's a really good
literate to
question.
the memoir?
That comes back to my writers group as well, because they did say that to me. They said, you have great stuff. This is, I was working on Coppins Hill. And actually the guy whose idea it was the fiction writing professor at Poly. He said, this is great, but you need to build an arc and you need to make some shit up. So you have this building conflict and climax and denouement. And I said, Todd, oh, just the name, sorry. I said, Todd, I'm not going to do that. No, I'm just not going to do it. It's going to work within itself or it's not going to work. So I think, you know, once you do that and go down that road, then it's something else. It's not autobiographical fiction. I think it's closer to fiction. To me, we're taking what's real as we remember, and we're shaping it into a work of art. And I didn't talk about Soda Lake. I'll just say something really quickly here, because this whole idea of other voices and other selves and being in doubts about who you are. Soda Lake, the book I recently finished, it may be unpublishable, although right now it's with St. Martin's and with Coffee House Press. It opens with a body disappearing at Soda Lake up there in Carrizo Plain. And then there's a whole series of chapters with different narrators. There's a nun who you don't know is a nun because she's gone AWOL and she wants to live as a civilian. And there's a weird Jesus sex scene. And then there's a priest that you think is a priest. You find out at the end he's not really a priest. He's a fake priest. And it's set here in San Luis. There's a chapter about the famous philosopher Heraclitus after getting stoned and thrown out of the 69th Olympiad. And Heraclitus, you know, what happens to him after that, we don't know. And I reimagine it. So there's all these different characters that feel like they're splintered parts of myself that I then let kind of extrapolate and fantasize into voices. And the challenge was at the end of the book to bring all the voices together. And I don't know if I accomplished that or not. I'm having trouble publishing it, so we'll see. But I think that's the Rubicon line. And once you charge it, then once you cross it, then you're going to keep making shit up because you're not going to trust the stuff of your life.
You go more from memoir to fiction.
Yeah. So I don't know. You're the editor. What do you think about that?
Well, I also write it, so it's a conundrum in my own head as I'm doing it. But I think for the sake of a good story, not veering too far from the truth.
Right.
But I think you have to keep the reader interested anyway. So.
Yeah, I was uncomfortable with the word memoir. That was Bancroft's idea. I called it, in this new book I'm writing now, Blood and Spirit, is called autobiographical fiction.
That.
Yeah, an autobiographical fiction. And that makes it very clear what you're doing. And memoir just seems like, oh man, everybody writes their memoir. I don't want to be in that category. But you get a publisher, you get a press, you get the PR people coming on and the publicist. Next thing you know, you have very little control. Early on, they wanted to sell the book as a book about bullying. And that's not what I was writing at all. Thank God I talked them out of that. And they focus much more on the Catholicism, sex stories and the priests and other things.
I think the thing that the way that I see it is like, you don't have to tell your story in a linear fashion. It's not like I was born in 1960 and
right. You don't want to do that.
It was 1990.
Right.
It's like, what did you learn? What do you want to inspire? What emotion do you want your reader to have or realization based on what your experience was? So I look at it more that way.
Yeah, I don't worry too much about the reader.
Pardon?
I don't worry too much about the reader.
Okay.
That's the only thing I would differ with you on. Because once you start writing it, thinking about what the reader's going to think, I think you've made a compromise that's also going to be hard to go back on. Not that you want to write something that's in your own head. I mean, you're not writing for yourself. But there is a point where you can't worry about the reader because you're going to trust yourself here.
That was from the editor's perspective.
Yeah, no, I hear you. I hear you.
Yeah,
I hear you.
But thank you very much.
No, it's a great back and forth, and you're touching on questions that are tough ones, and I don't have all the answers on that. Yes.
Just having finished a memoir, which is being edited, and having people tell me, no, you have to have an arc. You have all those things you just said.
Yeah.
Of course, so I looked up everything, how to be a writer, how to write it.
Right.
All these arcs where you could take the hero's journey. It could be like,
Right.
it could be like this or this or this. And then it was like, okay, I thought I just was going to write what happened.
You don't want to write just what happened.
And well, I didn't.
Yeah, good for you.
So, but it had natural arcs already there,
Yeah.
but I had to change things around.
Your subconscious probably knew where the arc was. I mean, something's driving you along,
Oh, yes.
and it's not always the conscious self. So I'm glad you didn't just write what happened. I'm glad
It
you.
turned out to be better than I thought it was going to be.
Yeah. And, it's like anything where, you see one perspective on it. And I remember, when the book came out, I was doing a reading in Boston, and I was at this fancy hotel that Bancroft had paid for. And this person came to interview me in my hotel room. And they said, you know what the best scene in the book is? I said, no, what? And it was the second to the last chapter. It was a scene with my father, he's a very depressed man, alcoholic man, had business failures, and he became kind of like my Willie Loman in the book. But I didn't write about him till after my mother died in 2004, because I felt like I couldn't put my dad in there. And then once she died, I was free. And this scene at the end with him and Lake Erie and all this, and I didn't even think about that scene as being so crucial. But the guy interviewing me was convinced that that was the most important moment. So, we write it, we release it, and we can't really control what they're going to read, what they're going to pick up. And I'm sure your book, people are going to read it and see things that you maybe didn't pick up on, as being really profound or
I
important.
think different people are going to see different things.
Yeah. When Spielberg made the movie E.T., this is for you, Hunter. And he was interviewed. I think I was in graduate school then, and he was on. Oh, I used to love the show. It was Dick Cavett. And Dick Cavett says to Spielberg, "I just love the whole Christian myth you put in here." And Spielberg says, "What are you talking about? I'm Jewish, And then Dick Cavett goes on beautifully and says, "No, the whole thing. This creature who comes from the sky." and he preaches love and kindness, and he's a vegetarian, and he does miracles, and things fly, and then he dies, and he comes back to life, and then he goes off to the sky. I said, it's Jesus myth. And Spielberg was just flabbergasted. He says to Dick Cavett, I didn't intend any of that. And Dick Cavett says, doesn't matter, it's all there. Yeah.
The scenes you read were so vivid. They're just really, high impact. And it reminded me of a theory that David Lodge had.
Oh, yeah.
That poetry is metaphor.
Yeah.
And fiction is metonymy. And I thought the scenes that you were describing, each one was almost a crystallized little drama in itself. And the whole notion of jumping off the bridge to nowhere,
Yeah.
As a metonymic symbol of living in Pittsburgh at that time seemed ideal.
No, and this gets back to what Kit was just asking too. I didn't realize any of that when I was writing it. I mean, it's so archetypal.
Yeah.
The river, the kids and trying to get across, and the raft and the jumping, and then disappearing down the Ohio. And it just feels like we've seen versions of this kind of archetypal story. And when I was writing it, though, I wasn't thinking of any of that.
Mhm.
I was just trying to take the pieces and build it into something, right?
Right.
It's also very boy masculine. 'Cause I grew up with 3 brothers,
Yeah.
and they always want to kill, steal, or
Yeah.
fight. That's their life.
And when I was doing the tour and the readings, I thought it would appeal to men and boys, but it was so interesting. There were so many women at the readings as I did all the readings, and they would come up to me afterwards and say, I know I'm a woman and I know I'm a female, but I feel like this book is about me. And that's because it was the world of the early mid-60s.
Yeah.
And they would say, your father, it's just like my uncle or my grandfather. I knew people like that. So it did somehow go beyond gender in a way I hadn't anticipated either, because it was about that time, that world.
You mentioned one of the books, I forget which book you did. You went between omniscient and.
It's the book I'm working on now, Blood and Spirit. And I go back and forth between a first person present tense narrator and a third person kind of omniscient narrator in past tense.
Are you doing that pretty much in a rhythm?
It's a good question.
And was it,
Sometimes they're short, like the ones I read.
is that hard?
And I'm working on chapter 2 now, and I'm doing a really long scene set in Martha's Vineyard in 1972. And I think of it as kind of like a Walpurgis Night moment. I'm thinking here of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf? Or no, is that the book? Yeah, that's the book where they have the Walpurgis Night chapter. And it's going on and on and on. And I'm breaking the rhythm that I had. So I think there's an organic quality to it. That you can't impose a mechanical structure. You have to trust the organic structure. So this scene is really long, and I'm hoping it works. Somebody's phone is buzzing. There's not mine.
Oh, good. Sorry.
You better answer it. It could be Taddy Keegan.
He hired a lawyer.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
When you were reading, I think it was Soda Lake, and you started with dialogue, I think it was dialogue. Was that the start of the book or just the start of the?
That's the start of the book. Where it opens with pick a fucking wall, kiddo.
Yeah.
That's the start of the book.
Say thank you. My biggest takeaway from this tonight, I'm new to the SLO writers, is really owning your craft and your art, and to not deviate from that too much.
Mhm.
I have so much respect for the group that I've been able to sit in, but that was one of the critiques, because I had shared a short story and I had started with
Right.
that, and they were like, you never do that, and I was like,
Right. Yeah, don't listen to that. I mean, I was worried about that too, because I have a sister who's never read Coffin's Hill yet because she doesn't want to face the dark parts of our family past. And, she's very Pollyanna. And I'm thinking, now I'm writing this new book, and the first line is pick a fucking wall, kiddo. And how many people are going to see that and say, I'm not reading this book? But it doesn't matter. That's going to be the opening line, no matter what.
I have no disrespect to, I have so much respect for the people in the group, but it was just, it made me smile inside to hear you say that, because,
Yeah.
The art of it all.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a grabber, and that's, it's, the violence of it is arresting too.
And, this brings Amanda into the picture because she's read the whole first chapter, which is, I think, 47 pages. and this gets back to what we were talking about just a minute ago. I didn't know that Harry Kelso, this huge man who was the manager, and I guess a sadist, he does some pretty awful things. He goes to the whorehouses and does a lot of obscene things. And so I was really worried about him. And of course, he's Jewish and I'm a Catholic. And you just can't work. And Amanda read it and she said, "Oh my God, what did you say about Harry as a character?"
Oh, he was my favorite character in that chapter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I had no idea what Harry was this great character. And again, there's there's stereotypes there to Harry too. We've seen versions of him before, right?
What made him a great character for you?
Well, he's so disgusting. I could just see the whole thing playing out as I was reading it.
It was the writing that made it.
That was his writing.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, over the course of the 47-page chapter, which goes strangely into a girl I was seeing who worked at the restaurant, and I hadn't impregnated her, but she got pregnant at a wedding. It was a sexual assault by a Navy guy. And she has to take a Greyhound bus to New York City because in 1970, the only place to get an abortion in the country was New York City. And so the last part of the chapter is about me hitchhiking to get to New York City, where she's having this procedure they used back then. I forget where I was going with the thread of this. Like, what was I?
We were talking about the
Talking about
character.
Harry, yeah.
And the girl.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I got it. Thank you. Over the course of the chapter, Harry starts falling down 4 different times. And all the kids at the deli are worried about who's going to have to pick him up.
Yeah.
And so even though these other things come up, this girl and the abortion in New York City, and I'm writing the scene with her taking the Greyhound for the abortion right when the Supreme Court throws out Roe versus Wade. I'm not kidding you, the same day. But the whole time, what keeps it together, and this is where do you make shit up, right? Well, this is where I'm making shit up. Harry's not constantly falling down gradually over the course of 47 pages. But in my mind, that's the art that keeps the chapter unified, because at the very end, he goes all the way down.
It's all the way down.
Yeah. Yeah.
I really appreciated what you talked about several times here about building a world. You didn't even want to write anything until you knew what world you wanted
Right.
to present. And I love looking at it that way. And I think for the 60s world,
Right.
right away, what comes up, the relationship that people can have to it, either they were in it and they're reliving it, their history is coming
Right.
in contact with yours, or people who've never been in the 60s and they can learn things. So I think it's just, the world that you stuck to, that's what you want to do.
And it's kind of a problem because, in Coppins Hill, I had a different personality before I started teaching. I used to be an introvert, which is hard to believe because I'm such an extrovert now. But when I taught in 1978 for the first time, this little being came out of me, and never went back in. So Coppins Hill, I could make it not about me. It's about me as an observer and giving you this twilight world. And I know I can't do that again with blood and spirit, but I'm going to pull it off so far, I think, until the narrator's at least 22, 23. But I love the idea of being the observer because you're giving the world. This isn't about me. I'm not writing a memoir because I want to talk about myself. I'm writing a memoir because I want to somehow create this unity of being that I can somehow put together from these pieces.
And would that even also be called creative nonfiction as well? Would you put it in that?
Yeah, I think it would. And that's my other love is creative nonfiction. Yeah. Creative nonfiction and autobiographical fiction. Yeah. And
So what's the distinction?
Well, creative nonfiction, you're not really supposedly telling a story. The story's in the mind, right? It's a meditative essay where you have to have your mind in a really interesting place. And you trust the associative powers of the mind. I'm going to talk about this. Now I'm going to talk about this. And now I'm going to bring in this thing about Nietzsche and what he says. And I'm going to go here. E.B. White has a great one about he's got these little chicks and he's trying to keep them alive at the warmer. And World War II is starting. And he's talking about World War II and Nazis and everything else. But he's also talking about his little house in New Hampshire and trying to keep these little chicks. And that's what creative nonfiction does. It takes these disparate things, profound and trivial, distant and close, and finds a way to knit them together, right? Walter Pater once said that creative nonfiction, and I trust Walter Pater on this, was really the highest form of writing because it comes the closest to music. And Pater said all literary art should aspire to the conditions of music. You know what I mean with that? I mean, you're forgetting that you're listening, you're just hearing it. And I think he's right about that. And I think that can be the greatness of creative nonfiction. The thing about it, creative nonfiction, is you can't attempt it if your mind's not in an interesting place. It's like a tightrope, you know, if you do it really badly, it's really awful. And you're naked in the air falling, you know. So I think creative nonfiction seems easy, but it's maybe the most difficult kind of writing. We're talking about, you know, the essay, the meditative essay. Yeah. Hunter, my man,
I just want
thank
to,
you for coming here tonight.
yeah, thank you. I just want to say what I thought was interesting was about how you were saying, like when someone asked you what was the best part of the story, you didn't really have an answer.
Right.
And when that interviewer was
Yes.
in the hotel room and he's saying the part with your dad,
Right.
and I had the exact same takeaway from the novel. I thought this scene with you and your dad in the car, and
Right.
that drive home.
I was always going to read that scene.
And not a word was said. That to
Right.
me was the most important part of the novel. And that was interesting that someone else had that same thought
Right.
and you weren't even thinking about that at all.
I didn't think about it at all.
Yeah.
But I started reading that scene on the second half of the tour, and you hear a pin drop in the room. And it's an intense scene that I'm, you know, nothing really dramatic happens except he's really quiet. He's not talking. He's deeply depressed because this big deal had not gone through. And I didn't know at all the effect it was having.
Well, that's why I thought it was so good. It's just
Yeah.
because like you didn't really know what was going to happen.
Right.
And so it's just this entire drive home. And you're just like kind of on the edge of your seat as a reader. It's like, is he going to snap? Is he going to lose it?
Yeah.
It's like, you just didn't know because he was depressed and we knew that at his
Yeah.
feelings. And it just made it much.
Thank you for
more
saying, I
intense.
still remember reading that scene at Cal Poly, the opening night when the book came out, and it was Philip Saul, and there was a couple hundred people there. And he thought I was perspiring a little tonight. I was really a mess there. And it's just hard for me to read this stuff. It takes me inside out. So I read that scene at Cal Poly, and everybody I knew was there. And the question afterwards was it cathartic to write that scene? And I said, no, but it was cathartic to read it here tonight. And I mean that, you know, when you get it right, you don't get away with it. You know, it's intense, always, yeah. So I appreciate that. Yes.
You talked a little about the art, and do you feel that your all of your books did end up with an arc? I haven't read them.
Oh, we're back to your question about arc. Yeah, I think it's an art first. You're saying arc. Yeah. I think there's an arc to Coffin's Hill that I wasn't aware of. I thought the arc was at the end, I have to move past Taddy Keegan, you know, because I can't stay where he is. And so the last chapter to me is achingly sad because Taddy Keegan's now just kind of doing things to hurt himself and show off and rolling down a hill in garbage cans. And I know I have to go past him. And I thought that was the arc. You're still a boy, but boyhood is over at age 14. You know, I thought that was the arc. And it ends, I shouldn't tell the ending of the book. That's not. But I think the arc is more about my father in some ways. He really, the second half of the book, he takes over, and that was the catharsis for me to read those scenes. And I think that might be, you know, a book could have multiple arcs though, right?
I read your.
It can be layers. It can be layers.
I
Yeah.
read it a few years ago when it was first published because you graciously gave my husband a copy of it.
That's because her husband did the author's photo. Amanda said I have to look just like that tonight, even though this photo is 9 years old. So I wore the same shirt that's in the photo, so I could look just like I looked at Eric's photo, which of course I don't.
The guy would have a shirt.
Yeah.
I do.
Yeah, but Larry said I still looked okay, so. Yeah.
But, you
I
know,
think there's multiple arcs. I think they're in layers.
And did they?
And for Hunter, it's a different arc.
Naturally?
Yeah, this is one thing I really want to hold true to, you
Yeah.
know, is trusting the organic quality, right? Don't impose, I know I'm lecturing, I don't mean to, But don't impose a mechanical structure on something, right? There's two kinds of writing. There's mechanical and there's organic. So the tree doesn't grow to look like a peach tree in Disneyland where they all look exactly the same. The tree grows the way it's going to grow. And when you trust the organic quality, content comes out of form and form comes out of content. So I don't know the voice. I don't know the narrative structure. I know what I want to cover, but I have to wait till I see it. So the form the book takes is going to come out of the content it's about, and the content I'm going to cover, what's in, what's out, what am I going to use, is going to come out of the form I've decided on. And they're like this. They're creating each other in a mystery of organic, Coleridge. I love when he says, in Kubla Khan, it was a miracle of rare delight, a sunny pleasure dome with caves of ice. Great art is a miracle. And when you pull a little chunk of it off, you're not even really doing it. You're just the secretary. You're just uncovering it, and you know that something happened there. I don't know if it can happen again, but you trust the organic quality of that happening. You can't impose it. You can't. I know we want to be control freaks, but I don't know how people, writers come in and, I write for 8 hours in the morning. I get up at 5 and I flagellate myself and eat raw eggs. And, then I duck my head in a bucket of ice and then I write for 4 hours. If I don't write 3,000 words, I hate myself. I can't imagine that. I would never write so many words a day or so many hours, because you don't just write. It's not like you're turning out. It's not bodily waste. Some days you write one paragraph. I'll write one sentence. You can't sit there and say, I'm going to write 3,000 words. I don't understand writers that do that. Maybe they're so advanced and they're so good and they're so great. They can do that, but I know what you feel like that.
I work on one sentence all day long.
And you know what? At the end of the day, that sentence is a good sentence, I bet. And that's enough. Have your gin and tonic and enjoy yourself. That's a good sentence. And read it aloud, check the rhythms of it. So.
And then the author's going to be finished.
That's right. That's all you've written. And I'm very slow. I do. Paranoid, that was 2004. This was 2015. And Soda Lake I just finished it last year. So that's another 8 or 9 years. And now I'm starting a new book. So, I won't look anything like that photo by the time I finish. Light and spirit. Yeah. I'm sure here, so it doesn't matter.
How many drafts would you say you do?
Okay, that's a good question. So there's two ways of writing. You just write, and you finish the chapter. Then you go back and redo it. Again, it has to do with what's idiosyncratic with you, what works for you. It's like my students. How can I study? Well, you study the way that works for you. Some people rewrite their notes, use flashcards. I don't know. For me, I write a few paragraphs or at the most a couple pages at a time. And I don't dare go on till those pages, those paragraphs. And it could be 20, 30 takes. And I'll say to them, that's when the doubt comes in. You say, what am I doing? I'm not very good at this. Is crazy. Look at all the hours I've wasted. I could have done something else. This is all I have to show for it. But for me, I dare not move on till those 3 paragraphs, those 2 pages really sound good to me. And I think the other thing to cross-check with yourself is there should be something that sparkles on every page. One image, one word, one sentence that makes that page dazzle. And don't dare move on to the next. Don't write just to keep churning it out and finish it.
So then when you get to the end.
But don't write a book every 10 years like me either.
Pretty much basically perfectly done. You don't have to go do the whole,
It's not perfectly done, but you're right. When I have the manuscript finished, it's not very painful to go back and go through it. Yes, you're right. Yeah, it's 85% there. Yeah. So in a sense, I'm not a poet, but I think maybe I'm writing fiction and nonfiction as a poet does. Yeah. Yeah.
So would you say what you're writing to begin with? You've thought through the themes enough, things that you really want to draw out? And
I don't think I do know.
No, you just go back.
This is the other thing I want to really hammer at tonight. The subconscious is huge. And I'm in awe of it. I'm not a cult member. I don't believe in this. I'm a cultural Catholic. I'm a spiritual person. But I really think the subconscious is so far ahead of us. And it just lets us in. It always lets you in at the wrong time. You're in the shower and you can't write it down. Or I swim at Avalon some days, I swear I let myself go and I'm a mile from shore and shit comes to me and I'm like, oh my God, I got to get to shore. It's when we let ourselves go and our subconscious says, who's that voice? You know, who is that person? And it's these other voices of the self trying to get you to listen, Tom. Get off that golf course and get writing. Tom and I met a million years ago. We were both younger and good looking.
Maybe we should
On the
call
golf
it
course.
biographical surprise.
Yeah. I think the subconscious is, I don't know, it just blows my mind how it's there and it talks to us. I think Freud was right about that too. Freud was wrong about a lot of things, penis envy and this and that and everything else crazy shit. But he was right about traumatic moments shaping us. And he was right about the powers of the id, the self within. I think he was dead right about that. So it's 8:10. We should probably wrap this up. I'm really sorry, but you went on for like, I didn't get on till about 6:45. So I went about an hour and 20 minutes.
Yes.
Hope I didn't go on too long. I had my classes since Zoom started with peace and health. So that's how it went tonight. Thank you all very much. I got some copies of Coffin Hill. If you want them, they're $20. I'll sign them for you. Or you want to talk some more.
Okay.
Thank you for inviting. I'm sorry it took 3 years to get here. But when I finish Blood and Spirit, I'll come back.
Thank you.
Okay.
And I'm on my way.
I thought that was the effect.
No, no, it's fine. I can put it flat somewhere.
Oh, I saw you walk in with that. Yes, yes. Thank you. Thank you. It's intense for me. I mean, I was pushing hard. And I think it's